Welcome to Witham Sounding Board, a podcast sharing powerful business tips, insights, and trends for those seeking to become a rock star in their industry.
Good day, and welcome to Witham's Lodging Insights and Innovations podcast. My name is Lena Combs. I'm a partner here at Witham and the practice leader of the firm's hospitality services team. Today I have with me Ken DeGraw, who is a partner in Witham's Forensic and Valuation Services Department. Today we'll be talking about financially distressed properties and strategic options to help planning the path forward for the hospitality and lodging industry. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today and taking time to talk about this topic and providing your insights to the industry.
My pleasure. It's never a happy topic, but one nonetheless needs to be talked about.
We appreciate it. So with that, let's get started. So Ken, when a property becomes financially distressed, and maybe we could talk a little bit about what financially distressed means and what that looks like. There are lots of decision points. And so what should ownership groups be considering?
So it's a great question, because that's kind of the where this all begins, right? The ownership group really needs to take stock of themselves. They need to take a very hard look, at least initially, and some self-reflection on what got them here. What are their metrics, both trailing and potentially going forward? What's the economy looking like? There are always things that are kind of within your control, and maybe a whole bunch of things that aren't in your control, like a pandemic. And taking stock of what's changed in their particular marketplace. Again, there are a lot of stuff you can control and a lot of things you can't control. But are you making the changes you need to make within your marketplace that are within your control? It's a little circular, but relevant nonetheless. And kind of the next leg of the stool I like to talk with ownership about is, what do they have in front of them? What's the value of the property? What's the value of what they hold? Is it fully engaged and tapped, or are there alternatives and options that maybe have been on the sidelines, or just flat out haven't been considered yet, that they need to start to think about? Along with that come the alternatives. I've got a property. What else can I be doing with it? I'm already paying for the property. I'm paying for the people. I'm paying for the things. Are there alternative uses that I can have here that can help drive some value to the property, and to the bottom line, obviously, is what it's all about. And then finally, the tough one, where some of the distress comes in, is, do I really want to keep it? Can I keep it? And if so, what's it going to take? We've got other stakeholders involved here that need to be considered, and it's not going to be an easy road. There's going to be a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of stakeholders to be made happy as you go through a workout process, and trying to think that through as early in the process as possible will pay some dividends. Upgrades is always one that's out there. Probably better said is, what's the CapEx that needs to come into the property in order to make it viable going forward? Because that's typically going to be a pretty big number, and that needs to come from somewhere. So we need to start thinking about how that's going to develop and what it looks like, and try to quantify it. The lender relationship can become critical. I'll talk more about lender in a little bit, I'm sure, and what that relationship looks like, and whether they're going to work with you or not. And then as you're going through this kind of early stage process, it's, what's the team that I need to help put Humpty Dumpty back together again, is usually the phrase I like to use. You need people who are knowledgeable in finance and operations, in all manner of different disciplines, which maybe they're part of management, maybe they're not, or maybe there's someone who does that on management that's maybe not the right tool in the toolbox. And we need to think about who the right players are to bring together to develop a full-blown workout methodology, or a sale methodology, if that's the route you're going to ultimately go down. And then finally is just, if you're not going to keep it, what's the exit look like? How are you going to get there? What's the value you're trying to drive? So just a kind of a early on here, just a ton of decision points and inflection points that management needs to really start taking stock of to get to some good decisions.
Right. So we need some good change management. We need to be sure we have the right bus with the right people on the bus and the right seats on the bus. And then
Absolutely. And,
some
I
honest
love going,
conversation with ourselves to make sure we're making good decisions with the right information.
you bet. And one of my, this is a little geeky, but one of my favorite shows is Bar Rescue, because John Taffer walks into the failing bar and inevitably he's looking at the change management. What's gone right? What's gone wrong? What are they working in their business? Or are they working on their business? All of those things come to bear when you're trying to think about a process.
Sure. So with all that being said, assuming that a property is worth holding on to, right? We've done this evaluation. What is the path forward, considering some of those things you talked about, like lenders, franchisors, investors, and other stakeholders?
Sure. A lot of sleepless nights. It
Don't
really
be so
starts.
positive, Ken.
The tip of the spear here is, what are the immediate needs? How are we keeping the doors open? How are we keeping employees paid? How are we keeping our guests happy? What are the immediate needs that need to be addressed? And one of the first things a turnaround person is going to look to do with you is what's called a 13-week cash flow. And it's literally what it sounds like. What are the revenues that are anticipated? What are the expenses that are anticipated? And we're going to roll that out for a quarter. And we're going to budget against that every single week, and we're going to keep rolling it. And that's going to take care of our immediate needs, to make sure that the cash flow is available to manage all of the processes that needs to be managed up front. I talked about the value of the property a little bit before. That becomes part of our longer term decision-making process that needs to start getting made. The capital expenditures. What do we have? What can we exploit? What's good? What's bad? What's ugly? You mentioned the lender. So there's probably debt that exceeds just the straight up lender on the property. Inevitably, there's trade debt and other third parties that are owed money, some of which may be pretty well stretched. Well, you got to start thinking about how you're going to cut a deal with some of them in order to continue to provide goods and services. Because it gets back to that first question we had with the cash flow of how are we keeping the doors open in the near term. Once you've gotten through that, now you got to start rethinking or thinking through some of the agreements that you've got. What are some of the trip lines that can really hurt us? Guarantees are a big one. Have you guaranteed any trade debt? Guaranteed with any of the lenders? Maybe it's just a bad boy guarantee where you're going to be handcuffed into filing bankruptcy if that's a route you decide may make some sense. What about our franchisor? Do they have issues that we need to be dealing with and be concerned about? And the 800-pound gorilla that doesn't get focused on until it's almost too late is publicity. Anytime you're going through a distressed situation, the publicity can be quick and it can be painful, not only in the local economy, but to your guests as well, particularly guests who may have put down deposits. And we won't even get into social media. That's a whole separate animal. But if there's enough negativity out there, everything you're trying to do to move your operation forward and create positive selling points can be undercut through some negative publicity. I mentioned, having a plan. And that plan, we've talked about it a little bit already, but that 13-week cash flow, short and long term, capital expenditures. If you need to make cuts, at least initially, use a scalpel. It's much harder to put it back together again than it is to kind of shave and build. It's a sculpture. You've really got to kind of shape it so that you're maximizing value while maintaining the proper services. Talked about alternative uses already. And then you need to start thinking here of, what about fresh capital? Is my lender going to work with me? And if they're not, where's additional capital coming from? Do I need to take out my lender? Which is a kind of a different question. Is private equity an option? Is ownership an option? There's a bunch of spots out there to potentially get capital, but you've got to have a story to tell. That kind of gets me to the story, the communication. And obviously you've got two big stakeholders here in the mix, the lender and the franchisor. And with the lender, you gotta, if you've been with them for a long time, you may get a reasonable hearing. If you haven't been with them a while, you may have some other issues. But there's some tools in their toolbox that, depending on the relationship, they can bring to bear to get you some breathing room, right? There's forbearance agreements. Perhaps there's a maturity extension, payment modifications, interest rate adjustments. Maybe ownership's got some capital, but not a lot of capital. Maybe they can take a chunk of that loan out and bring it back into line so the covenants aren't all upside down. Maybe they can split the note. So there's some tools there that the lender can use with the right story. So you've got to be able to go to them with that cash flow and that vision and explain it to them and sell them that this is the way forward. And obviously your franchisor is the other problem child in the mix. And so, what are their demands on you, not only for the near term, but for the longer term, and how does that all get baked in? What's the conversation with them? So lots of stuff to be thinking about.
Right. Yeah. A lot of planning, right? Just as we always talk about with our clients, planning makes everything a little bit easier. A lot of
Absolutely.
factors to consider here, and a lot of conversation for sure. So we talked a little bit about how we get on the road to recovery and maximizing value to try to come out of some kind of distress situation. What are the options if those efforts don't work out?
I'll put on my Darth Vader costume now. So there are a number of options that are out there, none of which are great, but they're nonetheless options. And some of them could be imposed on you, right? If the lender doesn't want to have a conversation, or the lender chooses to sell the note and be done with you, new lender is not going to give you a reasonable hearing, and bad things may begin to happen. The lender can certainly have a receiver appointed. That's another route they can go down. They can look to foreclose under their agreement. That's an option for them. It would be at extreme, but it's on the table. And there's potential they could also put a CRO in place, a certified restructuring officer, or chief restructuring officer. I'm sorry. That would basically take over the operations and attempt to turn things around if they thought that was an option for them. So as you're developing your plan that we were just talking about, you need to be conscious of the bad things that can happen so that you can give them the argument when they go to their workout groups to say, look, this is why appointing a receiver is not a great idea, and on and on. If the operator himself does have a number of options as well. They can certainly do a deed in lieu. That's out there. We can try to sell the property. Now we get back to how are we going to drive value, but a sale of the property is in the mix. You've obviously got to be, if you're not going to drive enough value to take out the various creditor bodies, you've got a different problem on your hands. And then you get back to where the guarantees. Bankruptcy, that's out there. It's a tool. It can be used effectively. We talked about publicity before. Lots of negative publicity about bankruptcy, right? It's out there. It's public. It's going to happen. And there's some really high profile organizations that have done that and have done it successfully. One of the positives of bankruptcy is if you choose to try to sell the property, selling it within the bankruptcy wrapper. So once you file, then you do what's called a 363 sale, which refers to the chapter in the bankruptcy code that deals with sales of assets in a bankruptcy situation. The upside there is the new owner receives those assets free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. So that's a big win for a potential new owner, that they don't have to worry about all the baggage you got. I've got it clean. I've got that fresh start that bankruptcy promises, and they can move forward with the property. Certain extent, a lot of that is outside your control, but there is very definitely some options within that. The last one I'll throw out there is something called an assignment for the benefit of creditors. It goes by some different names in different states. It's essentially a state law liquidation or Article 9 sale under the UCC, where you're essentially going to hand the keys to an assignee who's going to liquidate the assets and take care of the creditors. It does not give the potential buyer of the asset the same guarantees of a free and clear that the bankruptcy gives them, but certainly it's another out that's an option for you.
Sure. So, you talked about a couple of options. If an ownership group determines that bankruptcy is a viable option, are there some other types of plans that are available that they would want to consider besides the two you just specifically mentioned?
Yeah, so if you're going to explore the bankruptcy as an option, which again, like I said, it's a viable tool. We got to worry about the publicity. We got to worry about employees because they're thinking their jobs are going away. Bankruptcy, if you can get in and get out, you certainly can get that fresh start and begin again, free and clear of the obligations that have saddled you, or at least in a situation where you're able to come up with payment plans going forward to take care of that pre-filing debt that's out there. We already talked about the sale and the bankruptcy, but really there's two chapters. I'll back up a couple seconds here. So the bankruptcy code itself has got a number of chapters, and they deal with different types of debtors. Some are individuals, some are businesses. The two that are most viable here are either a Chapter 11, which is a reorganization. You're trying to restructure your obligations, maybe get rid of some of your obligations and come out the other side. Or Chapter 7, where that's a liquidating situation where you're handing those keys over again that we talked about. Either of those are viable. Chapter 11 is the one that when you're hearing the news stories about people filing for bankruptcy, that's generally what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's got a little bit of I won't say a bad reputation, but reputationally, it's very expensive and takes a very long time. Far more expensive and longer than you would anticipate it to take. So it's become a challenge. There was a new code section put in place. Unfortunately, it's not generally available to real estate. There is one characteristic within bankruptcy that deals specifically with single asset real estate cases, which has a very specific definition. We won't go down that rabbit hole, but if you can qualify there, it does provide a more expedited process through the bankruptcy system. So it kind of gets back to that team where we started the conversation of if you think a disposition or a filing of bankruptcy is a viable option, having bankruptcy counsel and financial advisors who have been through the process become very important to have as part of your team.
Yes, definitely having professionals involved at the beginning and through the process to walk you through with their expertise is important. Well, thank you so much, Ken. That was great information. I know very 30,000 foot level overview of some options, but I think that's great to get people thinking about what some of their choices might be and ways to move forward if they do find themselves in a position where they have a distressed property. So I just thank you again for joining us today and talking about this timely topic and providing your insights to the lodging industry.
My pleasure. Anytime.
For our listeners, if you have any questions about today's podcast, please reach out to us through www.witham.com/hospitality.